Good to have all of you here tonight. Welcome to the campus and welcome to this Inaugural Philosophy Conference. We are thrilled to have not only you here, but I'm particularly pleased to have our guest speaker tonight, David Solomon. David Solomon is one of those people in my life who exemplifies the grace of God to me because he is the friend I have absolutely not deserved. I have no earthly idea why David adopted me as his friend, but he did. And on the other hand, I think I do have some idea, and it has nothing to do with my virtues, again, the notion of grace, but it has everything to do with the things of faith and commitment to the truth that David exemplifies, and I certainly try to share with him. We've both been involved in higher education. We've both been involved in struggles to see that all those things that are good and right and true are translated vis-a-vis our Christian faith and the history of faith into the world of higher education. And I tell you that David Solomon is absolutely a hero to me. I want to read a few things to give you a bit of the standard introduction, but then I want to finish up by saying a few more personal things. But David is the W.P. and H.B. White Director of the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture. He is the founding director of it, and David, under his leadership, the center provides one of the most fabulous conferences year in and year out that anyone ever has the opportunity to attend. It is ecumenical. It brings together folks as diverse as Baptists and Catholics to include, and then everyone probably in between there. It is a fabulous conference that gives the opportunity for us to express faith, to express those things that we hold in common, and really to share ideas. And there's always stimulating conversation. There's always good food, and there's particularly good fellowship around the table. And I tell you, people come for the conference, but they come after they get to know David Solomon because they know that David will make sure that there's an environment for great food, great conversation, and wonderful collegiality. It's the one event year in and year out that I go to, and I come back refreshed. And when I come back, I always want us here at HBU to let's do something like Solomon does at Notre Dame. And of course, that's impossible to do, but I'd love to see this conference. I told David tonight, in the presence of others, that this conference is at least an attempt to be a spark off of the fire of the conference that he has generated for so many years. The mission of the Center for Ethics and Culture is to, quote, transform the culture in which we live into one where the dignity of human life is respected, the compatibility of faith and reason is recognized, and the connection between the truth and genuine freedom is understood. And if you unpack that triple set of pairs, you have thought about and reflected upon a great deal. David is not a stranger to the state of Texas. He's a graduate of Baylor University. We are glad to have him back here in Texas. He's been on a, 5 or 6 week speaking tour, weekends in a row, and so he is either going to be incredibly stimulating or very tired, probably a little bit of both, just because if you know David, he is someone who freely expresses his heart and mind, and so probably being just a little bit tired will even enhance the lack of inhibition that he typically has anyway. So it's wonderful to have him here. He received his PhD from the University of Texas, has been at the University of Notre Dame since 1968, has been a research fellow at Oxford and Boston University, visiting professor at Baylor in 94-95. He has lectured at over 100 universities, is currently writing on the revival of virtue ethics, and we'll get some of that from David tonight. He has Among his many works are 2 co-authored books, Abortion and Public Policy and The Synoptic Vision, The Philosophy of Wilfrid Sellars. David has a tremendous reputation at Notre Dame for being an outstanding teacher, and you'll get a feel for that. The two experiences in my own life where David came to speak that I will never ever forget include two occasions at Baylor when he stood before the regents of Baylor University and pled with them to make sure that the project being engaged in there, having to do with the integration of faith and learning, having to do with the integration of thinking and the Christian faith, would not be allowed to deteriorate. And David showed unbelievable courage on that occasion, and he did not speak to an audience that many of whom were glad to hear what he had to say, but not everyone was glad to hear what he had to say. He has been an advocate for Christ, for the church, for the truth, for freedom in innumerable places. He is my great friend. I've tried to think, what could I possibly say? I love Notre Dame, but I'm disappointed in Notre Dame for some things that they have done. David's Center for Ethics and Culture has in recent years not always received the affirmation that it deserves from administrators at Notre Dame, and I hope I'm not making them uncomfortable when I say it, but that's a simple fact. Go figure, these administrators, what's up with that? I recall, though, David, a couple of years ago at the conference, you'll remember who, but one of the theologians did this very interesting talk on, he used one of the Notre Dame slogans. The slogan was, God, country, Notre Dame. And at the end of it, he, for various theological, philosophical reasons, ended up by saying that he preferred to say, God, Notre Dame, country, like that. It put me in the mind of a film I saw as a youngster. You remember El Cid, where there's always this cry for God, the King, and El Cid before they go into battle. However, at the end of the movie, there is this interesting switch because El Cid is dead. They've put him on the horse, and he still rallies the troops. But the high commander cries out to God, El Cid, and the King. So I have one more revision to the Notre Dame slogan: to God, David Solomon, and Notre Dame. David, my friend, welcome to Houston Baptist University.
Thank you for that, Robert. I knew I should have brought my wife along on this trip to hear that introduction. Sometimes when I hear introductions like that, I'm reminded of the story by my favorite Marxist in the 20th century, Groucho, who allegedly once stepped on an elevator, and a stranger walked up to him and said, Mr. Marx, it's so great to meet you. I think you're just the greatest human being in the world. Your humor, your wit, it's transcendent. I don't know what to say. You're so wonderful. And Groucho looked at him, flicked his cigar, and said, Bub, sorry I can't say the same to you. But now, in the case of Robert Sloan, I can say the same. He and I have been in a few foxholes together, and as you may know, when you share a foxhole with somebody, you get to know them, and it's a pleasure to be here. I have said publicly on many occasions that I think when the history of Christian higher education in the last half of the 20th century is written, Robert Sloan's name will be the most important name in it. I look forward every time I hear more good news from Houston Baptist University, and I expect to hear lots and lots more good news as his leadership continues. And it's a pleasure to be here. As as you said, I am a little tired. I've been running around, mostly raising money to keep centers going, doing a little philosophy. Jeff Green, I'd like to thank him, too, for putting this conference together, a wonderful conference. When he asked me to speak tonight, he said, you'll be speaking to a lot of undergraduates who don't know much philosophy, so I want you to be able to talk to them. But there'll be some pretty good philosophers in the audience, and I want you to talk to them and make them really appreciate it. And I sure don't want you to talk too long. And so make it short and make everybody happy. I fear I may go too long, although I'm going to work on it. And who knows if anybody will understand anything. How many of you are undergraduates? Okay, cool. How many of you have read Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, you undergraduates? Okay. Okay. How many of you have seen Groundhog Day? That's great. If you haven't read Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Groundhog Day is the most Aristotelian movie around for a long time. And I'm not going to talk about that, but I'll leave that as homework assignment. Go see Groundhog Day. Read a popular summary of Aristotle's Ethics, and you'll see what I mean. Tonight, I do want to talk about a lot of things, big ideas. This is a big room. It's a big occasion, and I am going to try to be brief. The sort of conceit I want to use to begin this talk is a reflection about a certain kind of theme we find in classical dramas, in a lot of modern dramas that ape the classical world, where the narrative structure is dominated by a story about the gods. We've got the level of the gods. They're getting on with their life, doing stuff. Down below, we've got mortals getting on with their life, doing stuff. And then occasionally, there's an interaction between the two. A god comes down and sees a beautiful woman bathing and falls in love with her and steals her and takes her off. Or a mortal comes upon a beautiful god and seduces him or her. Or somebody steals a baby and takes it to the other realm. And then we get another added bit of drama. We not only have the interactions between the gods, the interactions between the mortals, but we have this back and forth between the level of the gods and the level of the mortals. Now, if it's not too much of a stretch, I would like to connect this to a certain kind of drama in contemporary moral philosophy and its relationship to culture. We've got going on in moral philosophy, the kind of life I participate in, where we do scholarly work about the conflict and development of big moral theories. Those of you who've been forced to take philosophy courses, or perhaps have chosen to take philosophy courses, have had to learn about competing ethical theories. That discussion goes on. Down below, we've got cultural change going on of all sorts of stuff. And that cultural change is connected to these theories. I mean, theories, after all, are about how we should behave, and culture is where we behave. So we have two kinds of stories going on. Philosophers talking abstract stuff, people living their lives, all sorts of things going on. And occasionally, we have kind of interaction. Maybe some philosophy becomes relevant to culture, or some culture sort of pushes us ahead. Sorry, I just realized I'm supposed to be pushing something here. Here we go. How about this? This is to help you out. And so we have these interactions between both at the level of philosophy, at the level of culture, and interactions between the two. Now, it seems to me there are lots of ways in which, and I want to talk about this tonight, there are lots of ways in which moral philosophy and I've already been told that I will no doubt spill this water since there's nothing but a slanted surface here. I'll try to be careful. There are various ways in which culture and moral philosophy can interact. As I say here, first of all, moral philosophy can be roused by cultural change. We have a kind of cultural crisis. Philosophers, at least we believe, can be called from our caves and we start doing our best. Or cultural change can be aided, perhaps even brought about, as I say, by philosophical developments of various sorts. Philosophers can come to our aid when we're in the midst of cultural change. What happens most of the time, and certainly what happens in contemporary life, is that there are complex relationships at all of these levels, and philosophies sort of affecting culture cultures prompting philosophy, there are various feedback mechanisms at work. If you want examples from this in classical moral philosophy, think about the way classical utilitarianism, the moral thought of people like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, was called forth by the great cultural crisis of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, industrial workers all over, especially the north of England, living lives of despair. And philosophers, certainly Bentham and Mill and the classical utilitarians, were partly prompted in their work by this phenomenon. In turn, utilitarianism as a kind of ethical theory, their work rallied people in an attempt to sort of make cultural changes and brought about features of our modern world to try to respond to that revolution. Or think about Hobbes and the post-Reformation collapse of political legitimacy. In the 17th and early 18th century, people like Hobbes and Locke were responding to essentially a complete political meltdown in Europe as a result of the religious wars. And philosophy did good work. Those ideas helped create something I want to talk about in just a moment, the modern liberal state. What I want to talk about tonight, more briefly even than I thought, because we're getting a little late start, you've had a nice full meal and you want to get on your way, but I want to talk about two narratives. The first especially has to do with this conference. It's a narrative of developments within recent normative moral philosophy associated with the revival of a view in ethics that I'm very closely associated with, what we call virtue ethics, the sort of broadly Aristotelian approach to ethics. I want to say something about that, and I want to be very brief. Water off, I'm going to knock the earpiece off, one or another. Okay. The second narrative is going to be about some cultural changes, and in particular, turmoil within contemporary culture about what I'll call the crisis in liberal democratic cultures. I want to say something about the revival of virtue ethics, this crisis in our culture, and then reflect just for a moment about how they might be related. So these are the two narratives. Now, the recent revival of virtue ethics, I actually have a lot to say about this. I've been thinking about this, teaching and writing about it for 30 years. But you don't want to hear all that I know about the recent revival of virtue ethics. And I'm going to run through some just kind of complicated stuff really quickly. To say something about what virtue theory is, here's a little chart. If one looks at the history of ethics, one finds three basic structures for thinking about ethics, those big questions about how we should live. And if you want to get a handle for these three, just ask yourself this question. I mean, think about it. If you were to ask this question of yourself, how would you measure at the end of your life how successful it was in the most general possible sense? Okay, all holds barred. How would you measure its overall unqualified success? Philosophers generally thought there are three ways to think about answering this question. You might think your life will be a success or not depending upon what you are at the end of it, what you've become, who you are. This diagram here is based on the three components of human action. To back up for just a moment, and since ethics, as I said, have to do with action, it's not surprising that some of the structural features of ethics might be revealed by this kind of diagram. Whenever we do anything at all, there's a person who acts, that's the agent over on this side. There's something that they do, the action they perform, and then there are the consequences that come about as a result of it. When you ask this question, I'm asking you to reflect on, you're going to end up, I'll bet, coming down with an answer that fits into one of these three boxes. As I say, one answer might be, the success of your life will depend upon who you are. You might conceive of your life something like an artistic enterprise. You're creating your life, and you want to create something wonderful. Secondly, the second box, you might think that the success of your life will depend on what you did and how you conform to a certain kind of set of rules or norms or directives about your life. You might think in terms of the Ten Commandments, say, and sort of think of your life as like a book of life with a record of everything you've done, and you hold it up. My mother used to always say to me when I was about to do something bad or had already done something bad, you know, that'll almost certainly be on your record. And I never sort of knew what a record was, but it was something somewhere where everything was recorded. Everything was recorded in terms of the actions that you performed. Finally, you might think that the success of your life really depends not on who you are. After all, who cares what you turn out to be, or even what you've done, but the success of your life might depend upon what you leave behind. What did you bring about in your life? Maybe you had to betray every friend you have, act in sort of cowardly ways at certain times, do lots of awful things, become even corrupt. One can imagine a sort of corrupt politician saying, yeah, I did a lot of bad things, but in the end, I got a couple of bills passed. Okay? Then you're thinking about your life in terms of the consequences you bring about. Well, this sort of homey, but I think clear enough explanation of these three options provide the key to the three great traditions in classical moral philosophy, what we call virtue theories, theories which fit this first box, where the job of ethics is to become something, to acquire some properties that make you what you are, kind of rule theories that think of ethics as giving us rules to live by, and finally, something like consequentialist theories that explain to us what we should leave behind if we're going to leave things behind. Now, I'm going to go through this really, really quickly. We could elaborate this in various ways. Just to sum up sort of what I've been saying, for a virtue theory, to be morally successful is to become a good person. Okay, it takes judgments of persons. Who we are is most basic. It issues in some list of virtues understood as properties of persons, as we philosophers say. Things like the cardinal virtues, the theological virtues. The notion of virtue itself is central to thinking about ethics, as it is in Groundhog Day, to give you a hint before you go look at it. And typically, in a virtue theory, we emphasize some picture of the ideal life for human beings that's to guide us in coming to be a person of that ideal sort. In classical virtue ethics, there's a focus on a certain fairly small list of virtues. In the ancient world, virtually all ethical thinking revolved around what the ancients called the cardinal virtues, those four big ones there: courage, temperance, wisdom, and justice. If you've studied any moral philosophy from the ancient world, that's what you will have found people thinking about. Plato's Republic, most important, or at least second most important book on ethics in the ancient world, is structured by an attempt to give an account of those four virtues. When Christians came along, we added the theological virtues: faith, hope, and charity. So we had 7 virtues to think about, and medieval moral philosophy focused on those 7. The 7 deadly vices, of course, fit with them too. Now, I talk here about a lot of recurring themes in the virtue revival. I'm going to skip through this, but just to mention a couple of things. In a virtue theory, if it's important for you to become a person of a certain sort and to have certain developed character traits, it's going to be very important for you to live in the right kind of community and with the right kind of sort of structure in your life. So there's going to be a lot of emphasis on building a community, building special relationships, people on whom you can model your behavior. There's going to be a suspicion of a kind of moral philosophy that will be very abstract and based just on rules. We'll constantly be worried about legalism like this. So we want a kind of community-based ethical theory if we're interested in a virtue theory. Now, rule theories, I'll skip this. We've already talked about what rule theories are. They emphasize certain kinds of abstract rules and norms. The greatest rule theorist in the history of moral philosophy is Immanuel Kant. Germans make especially good rule theorists. The primary role of moral philosophy is to provide some kind of principle from which we can deduce a correct set of rules. One of the, as people in this room who've been especially influenced by Christian thinking about ethics, as I suspect most of us are, one of the biggest problems in ethics for Christians is that in the Christian tradition, the virtue tradition and the law tradition kind of divide up the field for ethics. If you read the New Testament and you think about it in an ethical mood, you will see it's all about virtue. It's all about becoming something. It's all about transforming your life. There's a kind of disdain for rules. There's talk about overcoming the law. But then you read the Old Testament and it's the Ten Commandments, the Decalogue, carved in stone, heavy, weighing down on us, coming down from a mountain. And Christians, a lot of them have stumbled over trying to put together the Decalogue and the Sermon on the Mount. I mean, and that's partly putting together the virtue tradition in ethics and the rule tradition. Consequentialism is too vulgar and unconvincing to spend any time on whatsoever, but it's a kind of theory that's embodied. And saying that, I don't want to. There were wonderful people like John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham, the great classical utilitarians, were consequentialists, and they served a useful purpose in various ways. But no philosopher who, with half a brain, can be convinced by consequentialism for a moment. If you want to know why, we can talk about that later. Here are some features about the conflict between these three theories. The struggle among them is complex. Part of the great debate in the history of moral philosophy, and why many of us love to work in this area so much, is because we constantly have these kinds of theories at one another. But it's not just trying to win. Obviously, any life that's going to embody a kind of coherent ethical approach to things will have to have elements of all three of these features. We'll have to have sort of virtues, we'll have to have character traits, we'll have to follow some rules, we can't live together otherwise, and we'll have to be concerned about acting for the best. The debate is really about how these things are ordered. What's most fundamental in life? It's what's most fundamental: becoming a person of a certain sort, following rules, bringing about consequences. More and more, I find this very frustrating in contemporary ethical thought. The charge is made by some people that they can have it all. Many of the people who I regard as opponents of the kind of virtue theory that I want to espouse always say, we can handle virtue too. We can bring it in our little house, and we have virtues are just dispositions to follow rules. Or consequentially say, we like virtue. Being virtuous is always doing what's for the best, even if you have to lie to 40 people and betray all your friends. The struggle is complex. It's partly these theories battling among themselves. Virtue ethics absolutely dominated ancient thinking about ethics. In fact, it's hard to find anything up until the end of the 13th century in Western culture that isn't structured along virtue lines. And then things change. Rules and consequentialist theories dominate modern thinking. As I said, the high point of rule theories, or as we sometimes call them in philosophical jargon, deontological theories. The high point was Immanuel Kant, the Enlightenment German tradition. The high point of the consequentialist tradition was this utilitarian tradition in the 19th century. And for the most part, rule theories and consequentialist theories dominate modern moral thinking. And they begin to dominate it at the beginning of the modern period, that great period of change in flux in the 16th and 17th century, when we have the combined forces of the scientific revolution, the Reformation, the emergence of the nation state, the death of feudalism, and we also have the death of virtue ethics to a very large extent. Now, it's a wonderful historical question exactly why it died and in what sense it died. The standard view, and there's surely something right about this, is that in those great tortured years of the 16th and 17th centuries, we lost the teleological view of nature, a view of the entire world that suggested that things were directed in a certain way. That kind of set of ideas that really structured all of classical thinking. Certainly, most moral philosophers thought something had changed and we couldn't be virtue ethicists anymore. To revive virtue ethics, as I say here, it's going to be necessary to address this issue. What happened? Why did people quit being virtue theorists? And why is it now that people are starting to pick this tradition up again? Okay, so that's something about the conflict. But I've talked about a revival of virtue thinking. There's a contemporary revival of virtue theory. I know there is because I'm part of it, and it's ongoing. Many of my students are in this room who are also part of it. The man with the office next to mine at Notre Dame, Alistair McIntyre, is probably the primary leader in this movement, our senior fellow in the center that I direct. What's going on with this revival in virtue ethics? Well, it's part of a general revival. I'm sorry, this is kind of in-group talk about philosophy, but it's part of a general revival of normative theory in general. For most of the first half of the 20th century, moral philosophers, at least in the English-speaking world, kind of went on holiday from the world. They quit thinking about the culture pretty much altogether. We lived through, from 1900 to the 1960s, a period of two great world wars, a worldwide depression, cultural changes almost beyond belief, and philosophers spent actually all of their time talking about why we should keep promises or return books to the library on time. Philosophers didn't want to get their hands dirty with real cultural issues. Actually, that changes in the 60s, and this is one of these places where the culture has an impact on moral philosophy. I started graduate school, well, I started college at Baylor in 1960. I got my PhD in 1970. I worked the whole time in ethics, and I never once heard inside a classroom a serious discussion of a real ethical issue. There was tear gas outside the seminar rooms, there were riots in the street, the civil rights revolution was going on right outside my door. When I was at Baylor, I never got to attend class with a single African American. No one was admitted to Baylor until 1966. There were black and white water fountains segregated water fountains in Waco, Texas throughout my college career. The world was changing and philosophers sat on their hands. There's been a huge sort of transformation in moral philosophy where philosophers have wanted to get involved. And not surprisingly, the first people who wanted to get involved were these bad rule theorists and consequentialists. So in a book that changed the world in 1971, a book called Theory of Justice by John Rawls is the first great book reviving the engagement of philosophers with the culture. It's a Kantian, a straightforward gloss on the rule kind of theory of Immanuel Kant. Right after that, we get another great book by a guy even smarter than Rawls named Derek Parfit called Reasons and Persons, which is the first great revival of a kind of consequentialist theory. And thank God, in a few years, Alistair McIntyre was working away. in his great classical revival of virtue theory after Virtue appears in 1981. The revival of virtue ethics is associated frequently with a critique of modernity, the modern world, as it should be, because it's the modern world that dissed virtue. Okay? It was when modernity began that virtue ethics stopped. It's also, and this is a problem for some people, it's associated with a larger Roman Catholic view of the world, although there need be, near as I can tell, no special connection between this. It's rather that, for various reasons, the Roman Catholic intellectual tradition kept the virtue tradition alive and green and fresh within this particular tradition at a time when Protestants, I'm sorry to say, were more willing to dump it. I think there are complicated historical judgments there, but I think that's largely what happened. The virtue revival takes more or less radical forms. The part of it I'm associated with is pretty radical. It's connected especially with two seminal texts. Elizabeth Anscombe, a remarkable philosopher, a British philosopher, friend of Wittgenstein, a woman who had enormous influence on me and on Alistair McIntyre, publishes a piece in 1958 called Modern Moral Philosophy, which is a deeply radical claim about how we should return to virtue. Alistair McIntyre's stealing virtually all of his ideas from Elizabeth Anscombe, but transforming them and raising them to a higher level, publishes his great book in 1981. In saying that he's stealing all his ideas, I'm not outing Alistair McIntyre. I'm quoting him from what he says. Now, that's the first narrative. Sorry. Virtue's back, and we've got him, sort of. That's the first part of the story. For one reason or another, virtue ethics is alive again. An ethics is associated with character, with particular virtues, with community, with moral formation. Okay, that's the philosophy bit. Let me turn briefly to the cultural bit. Okay, I want to say there's a crisis in liberal democratic culture, the culture in which we live and that we all know and love, and should know and love for the most part. First of all, just to fix ideas, what I mean by liberal democratic culture is something like this. I'm not talking about the soft left wing of the Democratic Party or the Kennedy family or liberals, the way Fox News might talk about liberals or something like that. I'm talking about the grand political tradition which has dominated advanced Western thinking about our common life together for the last 2 to 3 centuries. We can say these things about it. Liberal democratic culture emerges in the American French revolutions. It's a product of the Western Enlightenment. It emphasizes primacy of freedom and equality. It puts it at the very center of the view human dignity, which is intrinsic and non-negotiable. Politics is representative. We all have our representatives in making common decisions about us. It's naturally evangelical in the sense that if you are part of this culture, you want everybody to be part of it. We're selling rights in representative government the way Baptists used to and maybe still do. We're selling Jesus. And it's allied, this is a little bit of a complicated point, but it's allied to a market economy. That's controversial, and maybe you'll want to talk about that. We should first appreciate the glory of the liberal democratic culture. It's first of all destroyed 2 monstrous totalitarianisms in the 20th century, really against all the odds. There were times both in our battle against the fascists in the 1930s and 40s and our battle against totalitarian Marxism from the 40s up until 1989, when people would have bet against us. But we won, and we won dramatically and overwhelmingly. It has addressed serious racial and gender injustices. The transformation, I mean, coming back to Texas now, having been away for 45 years, I'm astounded that the way the world has been transformed, not just racially, but in gender terms. Again, when I was an undergraduate at Baylor in the 1960s, it was really unthinkable for women to be pursuing, in large numbers, professional careers. I had one friend at Baylor who was a pre-medical student, and she was regarded not exactly as if she had 2 heads, but she was regarded as an unusual and remarkable person. My wife, who went to law school as late as the 1970s, was, I think, the fourth woman to go to law school at Notre Dame and was regarded as a kind of pioneer. It's astounding. Now, a very clear majority of women in law school at Notre Dame and in med school and law school nationally are women. And the way those barriers have fallen is testimony to liberal democratic culture and its ability to sort of cut through sort of social barriers to people's sort of fulfillment. Now, this claim is very controversial, but I would say we've successfully negotiated transition from colonialism to post-colonialism. That's hard. It's taken a few post-colonial wars, and who knows what history will say in the end. But a lot of people have been freed, and liberal democratic culture is still going on. And it's created enormous prosperity for its citizens. We're rich, and we've dragged lots and lots of poor people out of poverty. Liberal democratic culture has been a machine for creating wealth. And for many people, those of you who are students in the room can't really remember 1989. That's the year, for those of you who don't even know what it means, when the Cold War really came to an end. Soviet totalitarianism came to an end. And for the first time since the 1920s, liberal democratic culture was without real enemies in the world. And we all celebrated. And some people thought, it's all over. We've won. In fact, Francis Fukuyama, in a great article and book, which he dared to call the end of history, sort of celebrated 1989, meaning there was nothing else for us to live for. Now, it's all over. Liberal democratic culture has won. Rights are in place. What could possibly happen? Well, things always happen. And 9/11, among other things, happened. And as it were, the struggle goes on. But we have to appreciate the glory of liberal democratic culture. I want to talk very briefly about, though, why many of us are nervous about liberal democratic culture in its current state, and then I'll bring this to a close. And I want to organize my remarks around the threats to liberal democratic culture, and three of them. The threat of what I'll call individualism. It may seem funny for you to think of that as a threat, but a certain kind of individualism. The threat of what I'll call shallowness, and the threat of, I wish I had a single word for this, the loss of dignity. I used to call this the threat of secularization, but I don't want to make this too much a religious point, but I want to come back at the end and make it a religious point. But I want to earn the right to make it a religious point and not legislate it at the beginning. So what's the threat of individualism? Here I'm going to remind you of things you all should know. There's nothing new here. Tocqueville was perhaps the first person, followed by legions of social scientists, who pointed out to us that our democratic structures, in order to work, depend upon these small local communities that Americans are the world's masters, especially, at creating. Among the most important of them, of course, are churches, small church communities, where we all learn leadership skills and politicking skills. How many great political careers have started in the selection of deacons at a local Baptist church somewhere in the woods? Now that, Sam Rayburn learned all he needed to know about running the House of Representatives by being in a country Baptist church. Tocqueville said, one of these wonderful passages, from Americans of all ages, all stations in life, and all types of disposition are forever forming associations. They're not only commercial, industrial associations. This was written in 1835 now, in which all take part, but others of 1,000 different types: religious, moral, serious, feudal, very general and very limited, immensely large and very minute. Nothing, in my view, deserves more attention than the intellectual and moral associations in America. Paul Ramsey, the great Methodist moral theologian, once said of the Methodist Church, famous for its committees, he said, long after belief in the lordship of Jesus Christ has died out in the Methodist Church, the committee structure will go marching on. And that's true. I fear in lots of parts of American life, we're really good at associations. but things are happening here, and I will just refer again to another cliched reference here. I'm sure most of you know Robert Putnam's work in this sort of, what's become this sort of iconic article in a later book of his called Bowling Alone. Putnam did some very important work. First, before he became famous for talking about bowling, in Italy, where he compared political developments in northern Italy and southern Italy. And the basis of the comparison was this. In northern Italy, there was a kind of community kind of like America, where there were lots of clubs and associations. And he was able to establish a connection between that feature of northern Italy and their resistance to totalitarian regimes throughout the history of Italy. In southern Italy, where there was more, dare I say it, Texas-style individualism and a resistance to community relations, they were constantly prey to totalitarian regimes. And he developed a generalization, which I think is largely shared by lots of social scientists today, that there's a direct connection between a healthy, liberal democratic culture with representative democratic institutions and these sort of intermediate institutions and clubs in the PTA. Now, Putnam has done incredible work to talk about how attendance at PTA meetings has just fallen apart. Nobody goes to PTA meetings anymore. And his most famous piece of research was about how bowling leagues have deteriorated, hence Bowling Alone. As he says, the most whimsical, yes, discomfiting bit of evidence of social disengagement in contemporary America that I've discovered is this. More Americans are bowling today than ever before, but bowling in organized leagues has plummeted in the last decade or so. We don't want to join a team when we bowl. We don't want to go to the PTA meetings. We want to stay home. Putnam also has lots of evidence that you can't explain this the way you might think you could, but we're all watching television. People, you could even watch television together and all sorts. It's not because women are in the workforce. I mean, he's a good social scientist. We've changed in a way, and changed in a way I think that's threatening to liberal democratic culture. The second point, a little more substantial, what I call the threat of shallowness. And I mean by this, the loss of a rich sense of the good life in our culture. Philosophers, here's another bit of jargon. Philosophers talk about, especially that man, John Rawls, I talked about a moment ago, talk about the priority of the right to the good and neutrality with regard to the good. That we need to work out our common life together by just having rules of right conduct while remaining neutral on what we think is really good. But for the main problem being, if we start talking among ourselves about what's really good, we'll disagree, and we'll start the religious wars all over again, something like that. So if we're going to be safe, we just have to stick with sort of formal and abstract sort of rules. There's an emphasis in contemporary culture on what I call formal values: autonomy and freedom, equality, tolerance, diversity. What I mean by formal is none of these values engage any of us. And to see how that's true, just imagine that you come to my office. You're desperate, as some of you may be. You don't know what to do with your life. You don't know if you're ever going to get a job. You don't know whether to get married. You don't know anything. And you come and say, Professor Solomon, you're old, and I've been thinking about this a long time. What's your advice to me about how to live my life? And I say, well, I think you should aim for autonomy and freedom, equality. You should tolerate everybody that comes along, and really emphasize diversity. Now, I don't know what you would think, but you wouldn't think your question has been answered. If this is the advice we give to people, we have a Progressive Students Association, a slightly unfair jab at them. They're nice kids, but they're trying to do important stuff. And they put an ad in the Notre Dame student newspaper when they were formed 3 or 4 years ago. And they said, look, we're progressive students. We're really for moving the culture forward. We are geared up to do demonstrations. We can chalk the sidewalks. We can make signs. We can produce pickets at a moment's notice. What we need or some ideas about what to demonstrate against. So if you have any, send us an email. Now that, in a way, is modern liberal culture. We're all geared up to be for something, and we don't know what to be for. I apologize to my students in the audience who've heard this example, but I've been using it since 1967 because it always struck me as such a perfect picture of the emptiness of a lot of aspects of modern liberal culture. There was a game called World Ball that came to Austin in the height of the 60s, 1967. It came from California, as everything did in those days. You'll not be surprised if you've never heard of it. It's not exactly a game designed to catch on. The way World Ball was played, this way, I read, there was actually an article about it in the Daily Texan, and I went over to check it out. It was a 2-day game. The first day, people came together as a community. This sounds like virtue ethics. They came together, and they made an enormous ball. You were instructed to bring towels, sheets, you sewed them together, and then soft stuff you could pack inside this ball. And so by the end of the day, you had a ball 10 feet in diameter, soft and easy to play with. Then you went home, came back the next day, something to eat and drink, probably the 60s, something to smoke. You went to the same park. The ball is sitting there, and then the game commenced. And the rules of the game were you could do anything you wanted to do. You could go up and punch the ball. Some people lay on the ground, and other people would roll the ball over them. Occasionally, some people would gather on either side of the ball and have a kind of thing. And when people got tired, they went home. Now, World Ball, as I say, never made it to the Olympics. And I don't think it, and we understand why. And that's kind of like liberal culture. We show up, we got the stuff ready, and then what in the hell are we going to do? Who's good? You know, who's good at World Ball? Who wins? We don't want to have too many blue ribbons because we've got tolerance and equality up there looking over our shoulder. Just another unkind and unfair swipe at John Rawls. In toying with some of these questions about what's good and what I call the neutrality of the good, a famous passage from Rawls' Theory of Justice, where he talks about a quintessentially Rawlsian character, the blade counter. Rawls says this about the blade counter. Imagine someone whose only pleasure is to count blades of grass in various geometrically shaped areas, such as park squares and well-trimmed lawns. He's otherwise intelligent and actually possesses unusual skills, since he manages to survive by solving difficult mathematical problems for a fee. This is always an attempt to make this example look realistic. The definition of good forces us to admit that the good for this man is indeed counting blades of grass. Or more accurately, his good is determined by a plan that gives an especially prominent place to this activity. It will be for him the end that regulates the schedule of his actions, and this thus establishes that it's good for him. Now, all the things I could have been doing, learning to play the cello, volunteering at the Catholic Worker House, he's counting blades of grass, and all that our greatest political philosopher can say is, you know, if it's his thing, then it's good for him. Now, this is unfair in lots of ways, but he did say it. And he meant it. He meant it. And he's the greatest political theorist of our day defending liberal democratic culture. He is the great political theorist who's tried to put together a philosophical defense, and we've got the blade counter. I will tell some of the students, some of my former students are here who've been my teaching assistant in a course where we explore the blade counter, and I want you to know we now have a slide. I couldn't find it on my computer. We took a picture of somebody counting blades of grass, so we're bringing our course up to date, a blade counter in action. One last comment, it's not quite so frivolous, as to how this is a serious matter. This is a passage from, I think probably the passage that will be most remembered in constitutional history from Supreme Court decisions in the decade of the 1990s. It's a passage from the Casey abortion decision in 1992, which was a decision that essentially upheld the essentials of the Roe v. Wade abortion decision. And this is what the decision in this famous passage, trying to get at the significance of liberty, okay, this formal value. This is what the court said. At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. I mean, that's what it is to be free, is to be able to make it all up. No wonder the blade counter is as good as he can get, in one sense, from his perspective. I think we have reason to worry about liberal democratic culture when our highest courts are saying things like that. This isn't just world ball any longer. Finally, something that's really serious, the threat of the loss of dignity. We noted that at the heart of liberal democratic culture is the non-negotiable dignity of each person. One thing Christians brought into the world was the idea that we all count, and we all count the same. That famous church father, which Robert Sloan could, I've forgotten which one it was, when asked the question, how do you find out where the Christians are in the ancient world? He said, you can find the Christians because they're the people who don't kill their babies. So you can find them. They have practices to protect babies. Liberal democratic culture was committed to the dignity, the non-negotiable dignity of every person. Race didn't matter, brains didn't matter, age didn't matter, size didn't matter, beauty or ugliness didn't matter. We were all the same. That's in trouble. I want to talk about just three things in regard to that. First of all, John Paul II's focus on the culture of death. I think the great apostle of the loss of dignity, so the great canary in the coal mine, what I call membership problems in contemporary culture, and finally, a passing reference to something called the dignity wars, which is very briefly, this is a diagram. John Paul II, in the 1980s, when he was Pope, introduced the concept of a culture of death as part of his all-out assault on lots of the worst elements of modern culture. And at the heart of his doctrine, there's a lot that's obscure about his talk about a culture of death. But one thing I think that's perfectly clear is this kind of diagram. John Paul II thought that there were forces at work within liberal democratic culture that tended to destroy, be self-destructive. There were forces at work that tended to destroy the culture itself. And this is the rough, crude, very undercooked picture of that. I'd be happy to discuss this with any of you at greater length later because it is very complicated. This is John Paul II's take on how we got to dignity and how we're losing it. Dignity begins with a theistic conception of human life. Jews and Christians brought it into the world. We're creatures. And why are we special? Even if we're dumb and ugly and untalented, why are we special? We're all creatures and we're all equally creatures. This led to, at the top, the dignity and worth of each individual in virtue of this creaturehood. This led, through a few centuries and a lot of struggle, to democratic forms of government and to getting rid of the segregated water fountains in Waco, eventually, down the line. The democratic forms of government led to, as he suggested, this is a really complicated bit, various views about unrestricted freedom, relativism, excessive autonomy. We had Supreme Court justices writing things like the mystery passage. We had John Rawls writing about the blade counter. This leads to legislation against dignity, but once we undercut dignity, we undercut the top of this diagram, and we tend to undercut the democratic forms of government. This is why John Paul II talked about the culture of death being a tyranny, because it undercuts the very dignity that got the forces started that led to these views. The dignity wars. John Paul II tells us that dignity is going to be under attack, and everybody made fun of him, and here's an old Polish pope who doesn't know what he's talking about. He's panicking. And I'll do this very quickly. Here's a debate going on in contemporary bioethics, a piece that appeared by Ruth Macklin, a very distinguished bioethicist in this country. wrote a piece in a British medical journal in 2003 called "Is Dignity a Useless Concept?" And her answer is yes, it is. The President's Council on Bioethics, the Bush Council, produced a whole volume, partly responding to those kinds of claims, trying to defend human dignity. In 2008, Steven Pinker, a very distinguished neuroscientist at Harvard, wrote a piece in the New Republic, again, a sort of popular piece called "The Stupidity of Dignity." Now, I have some detailed stuff on this, but I'll just briefly, this is one quote from Macklin, which she kind of sums up her view. Is dignity a useful concept for an ethical analysis of medical activities? They're talking about whether we can kill, whether we can perform abortions and destroy human embryos. A close inspection of leading examples shows that appeals to dignity are either vague restatements of other more precise notions or mere slogans that add nothing to an understanding of the topic. Dignity, a mere slogan. She says more stuff. We don't need to pay attention to it. Pinker says a lot of similar stuff and concludes, look at the underlined bit. Bioethics Council's motive in trying to defend dignity, he said, springs from a movement to impose a radical political agenda fed by fervent religious impulses onto American biomedicine. Now, could it be possibly right that John Paul II was right, that dignity is under attack? What both Pinker and Macklin want to say is we don't need dignity anymore. We have notions like patient autonomy, which are just as good, which I think raises the question, can the autonomy family of concepts do the job traditionally that the notion of human dignity did? I think the answer is pretty clearly no. There are lots of, I think, ways of measuring the cost. Let's just stick at the first one here. The worth and standing of people becomes an achievement and can be lost. We are now in this country aborting over 90% of Down syndrome infants where we diagnose Down syndrome in the womb, and there are people working night and day to make sure we get that up to 100%. Thank God there are a lot of families in this country who are not prepared to go along with that. We've decided, in large parts of our culture, that Down syndrome kids lack the kind of status that they need to be one of us. Finally, the prominence of what I call exclusionary arguments in the abortion and infanticide debates. Marianne Warren, again, very distinguished philosopher, in a piece some years ago. I always read in my medical ethics class because we have to know what's out there. She said in order to have standing and rights and dignity, this kind of non-negotiable personhood, you have to have these properties: consciousness, reasoning, self-motivated activity, capacity to communicate. Actually, I've cut this out. She says capacity to communicate infinitely many messages of infinite complexity. I don't know whether she's studied Gödel's theorem and its implications for that, but self-awareness and self-conscious. I've often thought, I don't know about HBU, but a number of Notre Dame freshmen may have trouble qualifying as persons on Marianne Warren's criteria. Michael Tooley, another brilliant philosopher, at least he has the excuse, he's actually a metaphysician and not a moral philosopher, so we'll let him off the hook a little bit. His criterion for being a person, that is, being the kind of person we can't kill whenever we want to, is one is a person if and only if one is capable of desiring to continue existing as a subject of experiences and other mental states, which means you have to have concepts like that, which means you have to learn to talk or exhibit concept behavior, which means we are free to kill people up until they're, they can talk. Okay? That criterion was put forward in an article called A Defense of Abortion and Infanticide, published in 1973. As far as I know, the first article written, published in a sober academic journal that defended the killing of infants, 1973. Most of us who read it at that time, remember the day it came into the library, we thought it was a joke. We thought it was a kind of modest proposal, someone trying to show how bad things could get after the Roe v. Wade abortion decision. Imagine somebody defending infanticide. Now, the chaired professor of philosophy in Princeton, one of the chaired professors, Peter Singer, defends this on every street corner. And this is a passage where he's talking, we could pick a million of them, where he's talking about why we should be able to do experiments on comatose patients who can't feel pain and aren't aware of what's going on. And as he says, just the underlined part, without consciousness, human life has dropped to a level, in fact, below that of a chimpanzee or a dog. Now, this is what I mean by the threat to dignity. Now, these are, I sort of say I'm exaggerating. I'm not really exaggerating. These are all real stories. And I think they are stories that should give us some disquiet about the state of liberal democratic culture. But what do we conclude? Okay, I've got two narratives. We're bringing virtue back, and the culture's going to hell. Sort of, that's it. Might there be a connection? Well, in some cases, I think the culture has influenced the development of virtue ethics. In some cases, the development of virtue ethics has influenced the culture, and the influence has differed significantly. What do I mean by that, to conclude? I think there's no doubt that the virtue revolution, McIntyre's book, the fact there are a lot of philosophers working on this stuff right now, I think there's no doubt that the virtue revolution is partly prompted by cultural developments. McIntyre's After Virtue involves these deep and penetrating attacks on the sort of shallower features of modern culture, the characters he calls the manager and the therapist, and how managerial and therapeutic culture tends to hide from us what we're really the choices we're really making. He gives, and within the virtue movement, we give explicit support for philosophical ideas that support community involvement, and then I think goes against the kind of threats from individualism, and also that gives us richer conceptions of what a good life would be. And here you're just going to have to take that on faith. I say that we give more support to something called situated rationality. And what I mean by that, that's a kind of a hard, garbled term. What I mean by that is this. One of the main things that cuts people off from richer conceptions of the good is the idea that reason, if they're going to be reasonable, has to be something rooted in a kind of perspective on the world that's distant from their particular lives and their particular traditions. We have to cut ourselves off from who we are, because otherwise we won't be reasoning, we'll be prejudiced. Virtue ethics, from the beginning, recognizes we have to start doing ethics where we are. And being reasonable has to come out of where we are. David DeQuatro, one of my students, wrote a brilliant dissertation, which I'm not saying this to get him a job. Thank God he already has a job. Most of my students don't, as most philosophers don't. Showing how St. Augustine drove this point home and gives us support, those of us fighting this battle, for situated rationality. To be reasonable, you don't have to leave home and cut yourself off from your community. Maybe you need to sink more deeply into, of course, you need to be corrected, and communities can be terrible things, and they can do terrible things to you. But you can't walk away from everything and criticize. You're going to have to work from the inside out. That's what we believe in the virtue tradition. Has philosophy influenced the culture? Well, I think it has. The virtue revolution. We have promoted new and richer models of moral education, new models for applied ethics and professional formation. We've tried to get people to realize we're not going to make good ethical doctors by just refining the rules in the AMA code of ethics. We're going to have to form doctors in a new way. Robert Sloan's whole career has been dedicated to thinking about how university education can form students, not just instruct them. We've promoted efforts, the virtue tradition, to connect communities to rich and particularistic traditions. Again, the situated rationality point, that we need to be comfortable being who we are and living out of the communities in which we're in. Now, the dignity and membership issues are more difficult for the virtue tradition. As I said before, I used to call this a secularization issue. We have a lot of things to say about dignity. But as John Paul II said, the notion of human dignity, non-negotiable human dignity, began in a theistic tradition. And to tell you the truth, I think this is an open question that we all have to address. I'm very skeptical of whether we're going to be able, in a secular culture, to do justice to the non-negotiable dignity of every human being. With the pressures of big money, big science, these kind of aspirations of modern people to be able to do everything, have children that are only beautiful and brilliant and exactly the number they want, 4.5, spaced exactly, 16 months apart. I mean, it's hard to see how we're going to be able to resist that. John Paul II says in another place, and this echoes in my mind constantly, and I think it should echo in everybody's. He says, when people lose the sense of God, they lose the sense of man. Now, that's a kind of horrible thought, in a way, if you think that the sense of God is hanging by a kind of thread. It reminds us that God may have to save liberal democratic culture. It's not likely that liberal democratic culture is going to save those million-plus babies that we're aborting every year. A final note. Somebody might say, hey, but look, shouldn't moral philosophers just keep their philosophy untainted by cultural concerns? Shouldn't we just be looking at arguments? And why do we have to worry about it? We should be like mathematicians and get away from, here's Solomon up here just sort of promoting ideological stuff alongside moral philosophy and mixing up everything. Well, that's a good question. And I think there's answers to it. First of all, it's impossible to do it. The idea that John Rawls or anybody is doing moral philosophy independently of cultural concerns is utter and complete nonsense. In fact, the people who pretend most clearly to be remaining neutral in these matters are the ones usually most guilty of it. But leave that ad hominem charge aside. I think this kind of question overlooks, again, this goes back to Aristotle, and it's all in Groundhog Day, overlooks the Aristotelian idea that philosophy is a shared pursuit of the truth about how we're to live our lives together. Surely how we do live together will be relevant to answering that question. And looking at the culture and what situations we're in right now is looking at the way we live now. Sorry I went on so long. Thank you.